Since at least the 1925 Scopes monkey trial, the teaching of evolution in public schools and universities in the United States has been controversial. Many Americans advocate for the teaching of evolution be replaced or supplemented by creationism, based on the account of creation in the book of Genesis, or more recently, intelligent design, ID. The Discovery Institute, which helped develop the idea of ID, defines it as the theory that certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an undirected process like natural selection. Advocates of ID are adamant that it is not a religious theory. The Discovery Institute insists that intelligent design is not related to creationism and is not based on the Bible. They wish ID to be regarded as a scientific theory. To refuse to include it in school curricula, they argue, limits the free speech rights of teachers and prevents students from being exposed to a complete picture of the scientific debate. However, this view is at odds with the dominant opinion of the American scientific community. According to Alan I. Leshner, CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, there is virtually no scientific controversy among the overwhelming majority of researchers on the core facts of evolution, and it should not be taught as if there were such a controversy. For the AAAS, teaching intelligent design in science classes gives students a false impression, presenting ID as a credible scientific theory when evolution is in fact the only currently accepted scientific explanation for biological diversity. Given that the AAAS is the largest scientific society not only in the United States but in the world, its position can be taken as indicative of the overall view of the American scientific community. Furthermore, many taxpayers regard ID as creationism in disguise. This view has been supported by the federal courts, which have found that ID is indeed a form of creationism and thus cannot be taught at taxpayer expense. For example, in the 2005 case, Kitzmiller v. Dover Area School District. According to the courts, to do so would constitute an endorsement of a religious position by the government, in violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Whether or not one views these decisions as judicial activism, the fact that federal judges are unelected and difficult to remove from office means that this fact is unlikely to change in the near future. The various stakeholders in this debate, then, are in an impasse, in which neither group seems likely to convince the other. However, given that American public schools and universities are a shared resource that must encompass and respect the views of all taxpayers and citizens, some sort of agreement is necessary. Both supporters and opponents of ID can agree that education is not only critical to the prosperity of the United States, but that it is a core American value. It is thus important to all involved that public schools and universities be able to focus on teaching, rather than becoming a site for intransigent legal conflicts. ID should not be taught in science classes, because it is not a scientific theory. However, lessons on ID should be offered in other classes, such as philosophy, and lessons on both evolution and ID should be optional for all students. Richard Thompson, President and Chief Counsel of the Thomas More Law Center, TMLC, should support this compromise because it respects the TMLC's value of religious freedom of Christians and time-honored family values, because the continued teaching of evolution does not pose a threat to what the TMLC considers the religious and moral foundations of our nation, and because it is more likely to be accepted by the scientific community and the federal courts than introduction of ID into science classes. Richard Thompson should support this proposal because it respects the religious freedom of Christians and that it does not force students to study or be tested on material that contradicts their faith, and it respects time-honored family values by giving parents control over their children's education. Christians who object to the theory of evolution will not be forced to study or be tested on it, while parents who wish to see their children educated according to their religious beliefs can do so. Giving both perspectives equal airtime and making lessons on both optional, any appearance that the government endorses one position or another is removed, while taxpayer dollars will not go disproportionately to support evolution or ID. Second, Thompson should support this compromise because the teaching of evolution does not pose a threat to the TMLC's goal of defending Christian values. The TMLC is heavily engaged in the culture wars. Besides participating in the Kitzmiller case, the center also litigates against legalization of same-sex marriage and abortion, among other issues. For Thompson, these issues are closely related to what he considers the Judeo-Christian heritage and moral values of the United States. However, recent research suggests that the teaching of evolution does not undermine religious belief. In an academic article entitled Science, Religion, and Society, The Problem of Evolution in America, appearing in the journal Evolution, Jerry Coyne, a professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Chicago, with a long history of publishing both scholarly works on technical aspects of evolution and more popular works about the evolution ID controversy, argues that it is difficult, if not impossible, for scientific theories to discredit religious ideas in the minds of students. The reason, Coyne says, is that most people are raised in a religious tradition but only encounter scientific theories like evolution later in life. Drawing on statistical evidence, he argues that religiosity strongly predisposes people to be skeptical towards evolution. To use his term, it can immunize people to Darwinian science. These findings are even more significant given that Coyne is an acknowledged atheist who suggests in his article that professional scientists should aggressively combat the influence of religion in public life in order to make scientific theories more widely accepted. If learning about the theory of evolution will not lead students to abandon their religious faith, what does this mean for America's Judeo-Christian heritage and moral values? There is empirical evidence suggesting that an individual's level of trust in religious authority is the dominant predictor of their stance on controversial social issues. For example, religious affiliation has been strongly linked to negative attitudes towards homosexuality and a belief that sexual orientation is a choice rather than being innate. This case is made by Andrew L. Whitehead and Joseph O. Baker in Homosexuality, Religion, and Science, Moral Authority and the Persistence of Negative Attitudes, an academic article appearing in the journal Sociological Inquiry. Whitehead is a member of the faculty of the Department of Sociology at the University of Mobile, with a PhD in sociology from Baylor University. Baker is a faculty member for the Department of Sociology at East Tennessee State University, who also holds a PhD in sociology from Baylor. Whitehead and Baker note that the belief that homosexuality is a choice is correlated to negative attitudes towards homosexuality, and furthermore that individuals who place trust in scientific sources of authority are more likely to believe sexual orientation is innate. Conversely, a religious affiliation may make it possible for individuals to persist in holding negative views of homosexuality, even in the face of increasing scientific evidence that sexual orientation is innate and increasing social acceptance of gays, lesbians, and bisexuals in the United States. If this study of attitudes towards homosexuality is an indication, trust in religious authorities, not knowledge of current scientific research, is the dominant factor in determining where individuals stand on culture war questions like same-sex marriage and abortion. Yet, as argued by Jerry Coyne, exposure to the theory of evolution is not correlated with decreased religious belief. Thus, the continued teaching of evolution in public school and university science classes does not pose a threat to religious belief or to Judeo-Christian values. Third, a compromise position such as this is more likely to be accepted by the scientific establishment and federal courts to the introduction of ID into science classes. As noted above, the American scientific community remains largely hostile to intelligent design. However, there may be some openness among the scientific establishment to making lessons on evolution optional. This is because recent research suggests students can abstain from courses on evolution without compromising overall scientific literacy. In A Lucky Answer to a Fair Question, Conceptual, Methodological, and Moral Implications of Including Items on Human Evolution in Scientific Literacy Surveys, an academic article appearing in the journal Science Communication, Cosima Reginas, a member of the Department of Sociology and Social Work at the University of Bucharest, with a long history of publishing scholarly work on the use of statistics to examine the social, political, and religious beliefs of populations, questions the common assertion that a knowledge of evolution is necessary for students to understand the scientific method. She suggests a distinction between quiet scientific constructs, those like the theory of gravity that are uncontroversial, and animated, those like evolution and global climate change, which may arouse strong disagreements. Based on a statistical analysis of the National Science Foundation's Scientific Literacy Scale survey results, Ruginas concludes that an individual's understanding of quiet constructs is correlated to overall scientific literacy, but that this correlation is not seen with animated constructs. That is, it is possible to disbelieve evolutionary theory while still understanding the scientific method and possessing high knowledge of other areas of science. It is important to note that most professional scientists would not acknowledge Ruginas' distinction. Within the scientific community, the theory of evolution is not substantially more controversial than, for example, the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun. Nonetheless, it appears that among the general public, a person's stance on animated constructs tells us less about their knowledge of science than it does about their religious, political, and personal beliefs. This would suggest that students can be exempted from lessons on evolution while still achieving overall scientific literacy. Making lessons on both evolution and ID optional should thus be able to command support not only from supporters of intelligent design, but from members of the scientific community as well. But what about the courts? As discussed above, federal courts have ruled that ID is a form of creationism, and thus cannot be taught as a scientific theory at taxpayer expense without violating the First Amendment. In the Kitzmiller case, the judge noted in his decision that ID posits an essentially supernatural cause for the development of organisms, in contrast to the naturalistic approach that characterizes modern science. Thus, the court ruled that ID could only be considered a religious construct. However, the court was also very specific in stating that our conclusion today is that it is unconstitutional to teach ID as an alternative to evolution in a public school science classroom. Religious ideas are routinely discussed at public schools and universities in a variety of contexts, including courses on philosophy and comparative religion. In Kitzmiller, the court left this door open to advocates of intelligent design. Thus, by moving ID out of science classes and into these other types of classes, proponents can find a place for ID inside the public schools that will be accepted by the federal courts. While intelligent design should not be taught in science classes at public schools and universities in the United States, it can be discussed in other classes. Lessons on both evolution and ID should be optional for all students. Richard Thompson should endorse this solution because it respects religious freedom and family values, does not pose a threat to what he considers America's Christian heritage, and will be accepted by the scientific community and the federal judiciary. This proposal does not ask either supporters or opponents of intelligent design to abandon their principles, but it does offer a compromise, one that will allow American educational institutions to focus on the work of educating all students and representing the values of all Americans.